Now, moonshining, this was not a criminal act. It was actually very practical. It was a skill that people admired and wanted to learn. And at this time, it was also very deeply personal. Now, I want to introduce you to a man named Hamilton. And I'm sure you've heard of good old Hamilton before. So, Alexander Hamilton, he just saunters in. He is not armed with a musket. He is more so armed with a vision, and he's got big ideas, right? I don't know if you've heard the story of Hamilton in some form or fashion, but he was a dreamer. He had a big plan. Now, the United States at this time was drowning in debt that was still left over from the Revolutionary War. Now, Hamilton, he really thought that the only way to survive this particular chunk of history was to prove that the federal government could do what the old Confederation never could. And they thought, we're going to need to tax, we're going to need to collect, we're going to need to enforce. And while we obviously just fought a major war over these particular principles, it'll be different this time because it's us taxing our own people. And, it's not coming from this, cold, distant empire. So in 1791, Congress actually passed a federal exercise tax on distilled spirits. Now, this was the very first of its kind. So, on paper, it was very, very modest, but in practice, it landed the hardest on small frontier distillers who paid by volume, not profit. So to them, they're like, this feels eerily familiar, and we don't particularly like what's going on. It really did not actually seem all that different because they're out there, they're, cooking up their whiskey in the middle of the woods. And it still felt like these distant lawmakers, even though they weren't across the pond, they were still very, very far away. And now they're imposing these rules without understanding on the margins and how people were actually using whiskey on a day to day basis. And so it felt like they were crossing some lines that they had all just come together to basically defend. And at the end of the day, it wasn't necessarily about the whiskey or the alcohol itself. It was more so about the power and the powers that be, which is understandable. And at the end of the day, could the government really reach into these remote valleys and demand compliance? Could it actually enforce law beyond their coastal cities and the very small group of colonies that they had set up? And did independence mean freedom from all centralized authority or just British authority? So these are things that people are kicking around over a nice old fashioned or something like that. Now, frontier settlers, they had just fought a war against taxation enforced by outsiders. Now, the outsiders wore these American coats and called themselves citizens of the United States. So, refusal to pay was actually going to turn into protests. Now, these protests hardened into direct defiance, and tax collectors were actually threatened. They were tarred, possibly even feathered, and they were chased out of counties. Liberty poles went right up, and federal authority was missing. Suddenly, the United States was facing a question that it absolutely could not dodge. Was this a nation, or was this more of a suggestion? Now, we're just going to go ahead and follow the whiskey from the stills of Western Pennsylvania all the way to the halls of federal power and watch as this young republic decides whether it has the spine to survive its own principles. Because it's really easy to get mad about people telling you what you can and can't do. And when you become the person that gets to tell people what they can and can't do, suddenly those requests don't seem so outlandish now, do they? Now, this little whiskey rebellion, this is not necessarily just a little footnote, though I don't think it's taught very often. I certainly didn't know about it until I just started reading everything that I could about this point in history. This was actually more so a moment for America. It was the time when young colonies, Americans, this new country actually found out whether it believed in itself and whether or not it believed in the cause that it stood up so bravely for. Could this young republic even survive an open insurrection? Now, that was the question hanging in the air. And by 1974, it was not whispered in taverns, it was debated in the highest offices of government,